think what it's trying to avoid is this idea of long-running AI psychosis, where it just starts to go in this direction that it winds up being something entirely different from what you originally asked for.
Matt, thanks for joining the conversation. Yeah, I want to share just a brief background about yourself, and then we can jump into this week's news.
Yeah, sure. Appreciate you having me on. So I'm currently with a company called Swan. We build guardrails for AI systems. Been there for 2 months, and I currently run go-to-market, ops, and data. Spent the past 3 or 4 years really building an AI. So a lot of what we're talking about here is very much near and dear to me at this point.
Perfect. Well, this week's news starts off where last week's did around Buzz. I won't make the obvious pun, but there's been a ton of conversation about Buzz so far, and it seems like the model's really resonating with people. Another one that I've been personally playing with is called Type, and Type was interesting because it leads with this idea of workspaces and being able to define different workflows here. But yeah, I'm curious, like, what your experience has been in terms of workflows, working with agents, and kind of integrating them into the workspaces that people use today.
I think it's one of the first things that a lot of people, when they went to go build an AI agent for their company internally, they were like, well, where are we doing our work? And it's Slack in many cases. And so back at Crossbeam, that was one of the first things that I did was build an AI agent that had access to a bunch of information and tools. And I built that on N8N, but it lived in Slack. It was meant to be like a second coworker. So it had a lot of issues, but it kind of showed us what could exist. What I do think is interesting here is like now with Claude Tag out there, we've been starting to experiment with that. And it's not perfect. Like it will jump in unless you tell it not to, it'll jump in way too often. And
Yeah.
like actually try to make jokes. And it's like, no, you don't need to try to make yourself more human. Like you're a coworker, but you're still an AI. But we've done some really cool things with it. And what I'm just not so sure about is like Slack is already where a lot of us are doing work, and all of these companies are starting to inject AI as like a coworker there. I'm not sure what makes Buzz something that we would shift over to, but I haven't fully dug into it yet.
Yeah, and so aside from your Claude coworker being that guy always making the joke, do you feel like that's been a successful work modality for you and help the team and maybe even like less technical elements of the members of the team to better leverage AI and kind of like, I don't know, it's a different modality than the prompt, right?
Yeah. And I think like one of the things we're going to talk about in a bit also is this idea of context. But one of the best places for context is where you and your team are already having conversations. So if you put AI where that already is, you don't have to find a separate way to give it that context. It's just there and it knows it. So we're using Tag in a few ways. The product team is, and it has access to, the repos and stuff, so it can start to investigate different aspects about the product. But from a go-to-market perspective, we've also done some really interesting things with it, where in the sense of being a second coworker, you can ask it to do work that you otherwise would have had to set up some process around. A good example for us is we we have a way to identify traffic to our website. I think a lot of people do that kind of thing. And right now, we just drop all of that into a Slack channel. That's what we were doing before we had Tag. And we hadn't really put process around it, finding a way to get that over into HubSpot and then notifying the right person and all that. And so in lieu of that, we just asked Claude Tag to monitor this channel and notify this person when somebody with these kind of characteristics shows up, this person when somebody with these characteristics, so on and so forth. And then also give us like a end of week summary every week. And that was literally it. That's all we asked it to do. And it's perfect. It does exactly what we needed it to do. So it replaces process in a much lower lift kind of way, which isn't exactly what we were thinking before. But some of the things that we haven't even started to do with it that I think is like it's connected to our CRM, which is HubSpot, and all these other tools. So we could then take that a step further and be like, great, these 30 people, go add them into HubSpot and make sure that they're set as a lead and, so on and so forth. And it'll just go do that. Those are the things that I think is actually useful about it. not so much it trying to jump in on our jokes in our fun random channel that we kicked it out of that pretty early on.
Fair enough. I guess this also raises the question of like, for newer, younger, or more agile companies that are just kind of following the natural inertia of where Claude or where these agents can go, discovers these kind of workflows and the ability to implement them kind of natively and naturally within the agentic layer. That's going to contrast to companies that are more mature that maybe have whole systems around design, the exact problem you talked about. How do you see that shaking out? Or yeah, are larger companies going to be adapting to this more native way? Is there a lot of value in the infrastructure they've built, or is a lot of that getting eroded?
Yeah. I mean, it's always like the boat analogy that I think still applies here, where it's like if you're a very small company, you're like a canoe, and then if you're a startup, you're a little pirate ship, and then you eventually become a whole navy. I think Reid Hoffman was at least where I read that one originally. And that still is the case here. There's no different where if you're a full navy and you've got all of this process built up around these things that you have created over the past several years, that's really difficult to then one day just rip out and go do
Mm,
something that in the end will be more flexible and faster moving and better for any number of reasons. But the cost of doing that feels high compared to just leaving what's currently working well enough running. The benefit of starting from scratch and being a small company is that you can just kind of run this stuff without necessarily having to go acquire all this budget for 15 different vendors that all do like individually a unique little slice of this or something like that. But to answer your question, I think that those bigger companies can do it. It's just the inertia is hard to break away from. You have to have somebody who's dedicated to ripping stuff out and going to replace it. And they have to be given the latitude to go do that too, which is going to scare people because if you've built up an entire system that requires three or four different tools, people have kind of maybe it's like how you generate pipeline. And if you tell somebody you're going to change that if that's working,
mm.
people are probably not going to be okay with that. So even if something might work better.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I think about a lot too is just the complexity of larger companies and the amount of data that they have
Yeah.
and the need to silo data apart. That was something I thought that was cool within the type product was this concept of workspaces and that being a way not just to focus on work in different areas, but also to gate who has access to what. And I think this access control question is going to be really hard, especially when there's this big countervailing force, which is the need to pull together context for effective agent work and build out these context layers. And that's the next thing I wanted to talk about. We saw this week two big funding events around companies working specifically in the context space. The first one was Modus, which we can jump on, raising $10 million to try to be this kind of like enterprise AI new context layer, as well as we saw Credible raise similarly the exact same size check to be kind of an analysis and intelligence platform around context. Both of these present their products as new and required for this kind of AI agent or AI native company work. But I know you at some point pointed out that this is actually a fairly well-established space and people are still trying to get it right. What are your thoughts on companies like Credible, which I think you know pretty well, and where the space has been?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt at this point that context is super important. This idea of a context layer totally makes sense. Anybody who's tried to build AI understands why this is valuable. Whatever exists within an LLM alone is not enough. It needs to know what's specific about you. But what I don't think anybody has done is specifically nail why or like how that context layer should be structured, what it should be made up of, why it's something that you can't just do on your own. I think a lot of people are kind of doing that, and it in many cases is working sort of well enough. And to your point, like there are companies that have been banging this drum for a while. Like Atlin comes to mind as one that I think has been maybe even coined the term context layer. They really latched on very early if they didn't coin it. You've got companies, so Credible exists in the analytics space, but then there are companies that also are really big on that, like Omni. That's their whole thing is like We're not just a BI tool. We're the context that makes your AI for analytics run effectively. So I come from the analytics background, and so I think a lot about it in that way. But I also think the context layer is really important for any AI that you're building, no matter what, but I think particularly internally. I just don't know what makes one better than the other. And I think, like you probably have seen this too, but there's a bit of a spectrum for like if you're just going to build some version of this on your own, like we were talking about on the lowest lift way, it's like just throw an MD file with a bunch of stuff that's important to you and your company in there, and then you got to figure out how to maintain it. And that's not great, but it's probably good enough for like really basic use cases. And then on the other side, you give it access to everything that could potentially be a source of knowledge in your company and ask it every time to go find the relevant context. And that's not great either because you could have 5 different ways to define ARR in all of the places that it lives. And so I think people can make this on their own. Yeah, I spent some time making something that kind of fell into this space anyways, and I eventually
Mhm.
abandoned it because it is a really challenging space to like differentiate as a product. I hope to see these companies do well. I've talked with the credible folks before, but yeah, I'll be watching closely.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. There's a business challenge of like, how do you even demonstrate that your context layer is better than someone else's? As you say, we all agree it's needed infrastructure and plumbing, but there are different approaches to it. And some that fall more on the memory side of the spectrum, as you say, you get this problem of if you're going to ask AI agents, these probabilistic systems, to look over huge amounts of data and give you a canonical answer, an answer that needs to reflect like what is truth for your company, that answer can change just over multiple runs of the same query. And so that to
Also,
me seems like a very hard challenge.
it can also change depending, not to keep using, or like inception for context here, but like depending on the context of how something is being asked, that can also change how it needs to answer that. Like I'll use the ARR example again, but ARR may be different depending on if it's finance or, a revenue go-to-market team that's asking about it. So it needs to also have those nuances. If one of these systems can make that easy and not a burden to have to maintain yourself, like again, come from analytics. So a lot of times when I think context, I'm thinking like a YAML file, semantic
Yep.
model, things like that. Like how do you answer certain things? There's so many corner cases and if this then that type gotchas that you have to account for that is always a challenge. So if one of them can do that and cover those, then I think that it's at least a product that a lot of people would be interested in.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads us naturally into our next story, which is a really interesting announcement from the guys at Basis, along in partnership with the guys at Brain Trust, the teams there, this idea of a new agent behavior spec. And these teams are introducing this as a new kind of primitive for agents and to define their behavior. And it actually came out of the exact problem you're talking about of trying to build up large context to come up with answers. What these teams found was that on long running agent runs, it was hard to keep the agents aligned and doing the right behaviors. So they needed a behavioral spec to continuously drive them in a certain way. And what I find interesting about this is it is a somewhat different approach to the problem, which is instead of trying to validate input or output, I want to steer how the agent behaves over time to continuously align with a certain approach instead. The idea being, if it uses the right approach, it might get the right outcome. What do you think about this as maybe a different way or something related, but a little bit orthogonal to the question of context?
If I back up a little bit, one of the things that we were chatting about ahead of time is I think what it's trying to avoid is this idea of long running AI psychosis, where it just starts to go in this direction that it winds up being something entirely different from what you originally asked for.
Yeah, it is something we've also become very interested in is instead of defining what good looks like on the end of validating the output, because you're asking these agents to do something, right? And then at the end, you have to decide, did it get it right or not?
Yeah.
instead of focusing so much on did it get it right, focus instead on defining what good behavior looks like along the way, what a good process is, and use that to nudge the agent's behavior into the right outcome and increase the likelihood that the output is right. Companies will have standard operating procedures. They have a way of working. They also often have a philosophy of working. This is how we do our work. And that's meant to drive the right outcomes without needing to name or judge the outcomes themselves. And so, yeah, it's interesting to me to think about how some of these solutions continue to mirror what we've seen in corporate environments for decades, just applied to the agentic world.
I was gonna say it kind of feels like the way that we have had like 360 reviews or with it, whatever, like a check-in with your manager where you talk about how you're doing your work before you necessarily show the output. They kind of course correct you. This is that on like this micro scale where it's like in every little step that these agents are taking, they're doing this kind of thing to keep them on the path. So yeah, it mirrors how we as humans have done stuff just on a much more smaller on a much smaller basis.
Yeah, and lastly, one area that I'm also super interested in that I think ties a lot of this together is this question of all of these systems, models themselves contain a kind of logic for what good is and how to operate. Harnesses contain them. And then the kind of feedback loops that we create, whether that's training or other eval processes, all of these are trying to provide or direct the agent to get things correct. And Martin Casado at Andreessen Horowitz the other day asked this question, like, where is the value really happening and where should we be investing? Maybe even context is solved at the model layer. Models get good enough to find their own context. You don't need a context system. In which case, why invest in the context layer?
Yeah.
But maybe if harnesses or the way context assemble actually is the most valuable part of the piece, then these are the most exciting companies and the models themselves are less important. And so it's not just that we're looking at the landscape of these new tools that come together in AI native company building, they're also all moving in their capabilities and potentially competing for one another. And I don't know if you have a view on this, but if you were in an investor seat like someone like Martin Casado, what would you be betting on? Are the context layers going to get this right and really own corporate knowledge and be in a very powerful position? Or is it ultimately going to be the Anthropics and the OpenAIs of the world that really win it? Or maybe there's this layer of companies trying to help you fine tune on your specific data or come up with bespoke models, small language models. Maybe more targeted work is where the action happens. Yeah, I don't know. Thinking a little more longitudinally, where do you think these things are headed?
So this is a wishy-washy answer, and nobody likes that. But what I was thinking about as you were walking through that is, I think there's space for both because I don't think models are going to be able to do all that in the in any really in the any near future. And I know that things are moving at a crazy speed now, but I still feel like the idea of a harness is so important. And people, it was one of those like big aha moments when people kind of realized if you just let the models loop on themselves over and over again, they come to the right answer if you give them the space to do that and you give them the context. So I do think the context becomes important here as well. Like an example that I was thinking of was like a year ago, I was messing around with that idea where from an analytics agent perspective, I had spent all this time building these agents, these analyst agents that were supposed to have all the context in the world. And then I actually read a Ben Stancil post, writes a lot in the analytics space. And it was basically like, what would happen if you just sort of like let agents go loose, go wild on this stuff? And I made this like really simple thing that I called Calvin Ball from Calvin and Hobbes. Real ones know. And it had no context, no anything. It was literally just a janky harness that connected to Snowflake and gave it the ability to quickly figure out what all of the tables and schemas were. And then you could ask it a question and it would just go do deep research and keep trying to figure out like what does a table look like? All right, here's the columns that are in there. I'm going to go run 15 queries to get an idea of what's inside of there. And I was shocked at as the models got better, how well the harness actually enabled it to go figure stuff out without me having to tell it anything. the data has to be in a decent enough shape, but yeah, that idea of how much better a really good model got by just giving it a harness that I built in a night tells me that the harness is still important, and I still think is going to be a key part of it because for most of us, we want something that can go figure, can like kind of figure it out and like loop back on itself. So I don't know. I'm not a VC for very good reasons, but that's kind of that's where my head goes immediately when I hear that.
Well, I think, and that lands where I want to end perfectly because, I think this question of the agent, like, how's it going to kind of loop back on itself to get where it needs to go, is the real question of value that I think a lot of these are trying to be pieces of the puzzle to, or ultimately answers to. And I thought Andrew Chen, also at Andreessen Horowitz Speedrun, captured this really well. He was observing that a lot of the early stage companies he works with last year were all about a co-pilot for X, but this year it's about the agent for X. And that's an interesting shift because the co-pilot helps you get the work done. The agent does the work for you. And so, viewed through that lens, there's going to be increasing demand, I think, for whatever solution can get you to done faster. And who will own that and what the mechanics of getting that right will be, I think will really shape the market. And something that is really interesting to explore in AI native company building. And I think, the last piece of this would be, look, if you figure out how to get done right, then that changes the shape of what a company even looks like. Because we're now no longer talking about technology as a tool to augment human effort. We're talking about companies themselves operating on the machinery of agents from start to finish. What do you think? Is that achievable, or are we always going to be helping the agents along the way?
I think people will always be necessary to some extent to steer. And I'll tell you why. It might also just be me trying to convince myself that I still have some value in the future. Uh,
I'm there with you.
yeah. But this is one of the biggest things that I've been telling people, like, was my kind of aha about what makes AI, like how you can actually use AI at work effectively. I think a lot of people still outside of our little bubble look at it as like, oh, it's chat GPT. It's something that you ask a question and it gives you an answer. And what you really need to shift is like, it's something that can do work. I think that's a lot of what Andrew Chen was talking about in that tweet there was it's if you give it the ability to go do things and take actions and go do work, that unlocks all of the potential of it right now and all the things that I think when you separate out the AI stories of people building things that aren't really real versus the people who are using it to do real things. It's about making it do the right kind of work. That said, that's where I think the value of still having somebody kind of steering it is important. I think a lot of what Andrew Chen is talking about there is when it keeps coming back and being like, here's my plan. Do you want me to execute this? Or like constantly checking in. I understand why that's a little bit frustrating in many cases. But I think what's important is that somebody is driving the strategy of how it's going to go do things. Like right now, one of the big things that I'm working on is coming up with a list of companies that are good fits for us at Gray Swan. And there's a variety of
Mhm.
factors that go into that. I'm not going over to Claude Code and being like, come up with good companies for Gray Swan, and then just leaving it and like being like, don't talk to me, figure it out. I'm kind of curious what it would do, but oh, I'm more giving it the I'm pointing it in the directions that we know are important for us. Like these companies have to have a certain set of criteria. These companies should match X, Y, and Z. There's like a spectrum of things. And what I'm asking it to go do is find all of those factors and tell us whether they are doing X, whether they're doing Y, whether they're doing Z, and then put it on a spectrum of here. So it's doing that work, but I'm still driving what it actually needs to go do. Maybe in Andrew Chen's mind, I'm a laggard. Like maybe where he wants things to be is take all of that off of his plate. But I still think that there's value in having people who have done it the old way and kind of know what makes sense to the work that makes sense to automate and the work that makes sense to still be thinking about. I still think that there's value in that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the system ultimately needs to retain judgment somewhere. And the interesting question will be, where does that come from and does it evolve? Anyway, thanks so much, Matt, for a really great conversation. on this week's Inside AI Native. Please join us at insideainative.com. Subscribe if you want to hear next week's episode and join the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you.